Welcome to Who's That Pokémon, the most in-depth Pokémon anime rewatch podcast on the entire internet. If you didn't know, this is a retrospective look back on the Pokémon anime series, episode by episode from the very beginning. This show has been airing for over 20 years now and has over 1,000 episodes, yet it seems to get neglected by Pokémon fans, so I thought it was about time it got a podcast entirely dedicated to it. The first and only episode today is a very special one. It's the 35th episode of the Indigo League series titled The Legend of Dratini. That name probably rings a bell for a lot of you because it's quite infamous, as we will soon find out. This episode first aired in Japan on November 25, 1997, but never aired anywhere else. It's been over 8,100 days since it first aired, and it's never happening. It's never airing in any language other than Japanese. So why was it banned? Well, it seems it was largely due to the heavy use of firearms in this episode, which are pointed at Ash, Kaiser, and fired at Jesse, James, and Meowth all throughout the episode. Even though the scenes where Kaiser threatens Ash, Misty, and Brock with the guns were intended for comedic effect, 4Kids still found this too dark for children. Although 4Kids used footage of this episode in the Poker app, which means they did obtain the episodes from Japan. According to Eric Stewart, there was never an English dub of this episode, as network television were never going to be okay with, the sort of having Kaiser pointing a gun directly at Ash. That was just not going to fly. Unfortunately for fans, this episode not airing created a major plot hole for the non-Japanese version of the show. It ended up confusing many viewers on how, when, where, and why Ash caught 30 Tauros, even though Professor Oak does mention it once in Showdown at the Poke Corral. And to a lesser extent, this episode also explains Team Rocket's plan for the episode Ditto's Mysterious Mansion. So, a more minor one, but yeah, the big one is the fact that unless you were in Japan, you never got to see Ash obtain his Tauros. And the ever insightful Dogasu, who runs Dogasu's Backpack over as part of Bulbapedia, I think it's part of Bulbapedia, they're definitely linked. He basically sums up why this use of guns was bad compared to the other uses, because we've seen guns used a couple of times already in this show, and I've sort of been questioning, why were they okay, but this one wasn't okay, and he's sort of put together a nice little summary. He says, the difference between the guns in this episode and the guns in other episodes is that in this one, the guns were actually fired. In this episode, the guns are actually held right up to people's heads. We also have the guns on screen much longer than those other instances combined. Also, this episode features a gun that is sort of more common. It's a typical handgun, which probably sort of an American network's going to see that. They see someone with a comical bazooka, or even an old-timey sort of rifle, and they might be able to let it slide, but then when Kaiser just pulls out a typical sort of handgun that you could actually probably see in everyday life in America, well, yeah, it's probably going to make it a little bit hard to go to air. So while this was the first episode to be fully banned basically everywhere outside of Japan, there had been some bannings that created sort of plot holes or skipped over important events, mostly in South Korea. These were Challenge of the Samurai, Pokemon Sensation, and the Ninja Poke Showdown. These featured Ash's Metapod evolving into Butterfree, Ash earning the Rainbow Badge, and Ash earning the Soul Badge. And as I said, all were banned in South Korea due to the overt references to Japanese culture because of, that's just not a thing that they really wanted to show in South Korea. There was tense relationships between the two countries, so yeah. As I sort of briefly touched on as well, this episode was actually, footage from it was used for the Poke Rap. We get the footage of Dratini, Dragonair, and Rhyhorn all coming from this episode. And then there's a clip of Ash, Misty, and Brock sort of catching the Gyarados on the fishing lure. There's also a second use of footage from this episode. The footage of Dratini and Dragonair is used in the music video for What Kind of Pokemon Are You in Pikachu's Jukebox. So clearly 4Kids were given access to it, which I don't think there was ever sort of a question, because Japan wouldn't have just not given it to them. They would have assumed that it would probably be fine to go to air. And yeah, as I've sort of analysed in my GS Ball video over on YouTube, the only episode it seems that they were never actually given when it comes to the original series was Electric Soldier Porygon. Everything else seemed to have been handed over, and it was, up to 4Kids to use their discretion on what goes to air and what doesn't. Despite the episode never airing in English, a summary was actually posted on Pokemon.com. The episode was numbered as episode 35. It didn't have an English title, but yeah, still it's crazy that they put a summary on there. I guess they might have seen it as a way to sort of explain how Ash gets all his Tauros, but yeah, it is a little bit strange. And again, on a similar note, the Japanese version of Netflix actually has English descriptions for every banned episode, which includes this episode. The one for this episode says, Ash and his friends meet the warden of the Safari Zone. While being briefed on the safari rules at his office, they spot an intriguing photograph. So yeah, there's a few English mentions of this episode. On this day in Pokemon history for the air date here, we've got Kazuya Nakai's birthday. He has done voices for One Piece, Samurai Champloo, Death Note, Naruto, Fullmetal Alchemist, and Dragon Ball Super. But in Pokemon, he was the voice of Nando in Sinnoh, as well as a couple of minor characters. His first appearance was actually as Woodruff in the Johto episode A Sappy Ending, so pretty notable voice actor, but hasn't done a whole lot when it comes to Pokemon. And in 2010, Pokemon Ranger Guardian Signs was released in Australia, which Guardian Signs was the third and so far final Pokemon Ranger release. I'm not sure if I've mentioned it on this show before, but I absolutely loved the second Ranger game. I adored it. Was never really a big fan of the first Ranger game. I thought the mechanics the stylus mechanics didn't work very well, and I thought in the second one they really sort of fine-tuned it and made the gameplay actually enjoyable. But for whatever reason, I just never felt compelled to get Guardian Signs, and I don't really know why, because for a long time, Shadows of Almia, I would legit talk about that as one of my favorite games of all time. I would say in the few years after I played Shadows of Almia, it would definitely have been top 5, maybe even top 3. I loved that game that much. I loved the story, I loved just everything about it. But yeah, never wanted to buy the sequel for some reason. The IMDb rating for this episode is a 7.6, not too shabby for something that's banned and most people outside of Japan probably would have never seen. The screenplay was written by Hideki Sonoda. This is the 7th episode he's written for the show, and he last wrote The Punchy Pokemon. The director is Toshiaki Suzuki, who ties Yuji Asada for most episodes directed with 7, and he also last directed The Punchy Pokemon, so another re-team up. We've seen these quite often now. There's no major human character debuts here, but we have a few Pokemon debuts. We've obviously got Tauros debuting here. We've got Rhydon, Dratini, and Dragonair. The Who's That Pokemon for The Legend of Dratini is Tauros. You probably would have thought, considering the episode is called The Legend of Dratini, it would be Dratini or maybe even Dragonair, but no, it's Tauros, clearly to signify and represent the fact that Ash caught a bunch of them. But with all of that said, that's easily the most background info we've ever had for an episode here. Or maybe the first episode might have had more, because obviously it's the first episode, there's so much to cover. But yeah, this is, if it's not the first or the most, it's definitely the second most. But now it's time to jump into our episode summary and discussion. So I've got to mention before I get into the actual episode here, the Japanese intro is a low-key banger. I actually really enjoyed it. Obviously, I'm never going to be able to properly compare it to the original Pokemon theme because I've got so much nostalgia attached to it. But yeah, it's actually a pretty good intro here. So, as Ash, Misty, and Brock are about to reach the Safari Zone, Ash is happily singing along. Brock asks Ash to stop singing, but Ash ignores him. Misty and Pikachu sing along, and Brock eventually gives in and decides to sing as well. Just then, a man approaches from a nearby building and abruptly demands that they keep quiet. When Ash asks what the man's problem is, the man pulls out a firearm and asks whether he wants to get shot. The group hastily apologizes and the man relents, then introducing himself as Kaiser, the Safari Zone warden. We finally did it. We are in the Safari Zone for real. The past 2 episodes have been sort of cock-teasing us, but we are here in the legit Safari Zone. We finally made it. And fun fact, this is the only time any Safari Zone has ever been shown in the anime, which when I read that, I was blown away that they've never really featured the Safari Zone. That's such a no-brainer episode. That's one episode every region that you could just tick off. But yeah, this is the only time they went there. I also have no idea why they decided to make the really weird distinction between sort of the Safari Land and the Safari Zone. It just makes things so confusing and awkward, even without 4 kids and their awkward translations of that and sort of basically outright stating that they're in the Safari Zone. Even just looking at the Japanese here, it's just an unnecessary distinction. I thought it was really funny that Brock was getting so upset with Ash's singing. I was trying to a lot of this episode I was trying to imagine how they would have dubbed it and what they would have had sort of the various characters actually saying in English. And I was finding it really hard to visualize how Eric Stewart would have sort of played off these moments, because they seem sort of so out of character for what we know Brock to be. Like, I've never seen Brock really act like this, and we definitely hadn't seen Brock act like this in the first 34 episodes. So yeah, it was really interesting to sort of imagine how Brock would have acted in English. Also, I was absolutely blown away to find out that the first instance of the gang getting guns pointed at them is because Ash was singing badly. It's just, you would not expect that. If someone had told me that, I wouldn't have believed them. Inside the warden's office, Kaiser shows the group a basket of safari balls and a fishing rod. Ash is delighted and reaches out eagerly for them, but Kaiser pulls his gun out and explains the rules of the safari zone. All that is permitted to be used are safari balls and the fishing rod. If they break the rules, his gun, nicknamed Thunderbolt, will burn them. He then points the gun at Ash's head to demonstrate his point. Misty notices a picture of Kaiser as a young man in which he's holding a Dratini. As Ash and Misty view the picture, Brock tells them that he's heard rumours of a Dratini living in the safari zone. Suddenly, Kaiser leaps forward and snatches the picture from Misty's hand, screaming that there are no Dratini. Ash argues otherwise, but he's silenced by seeing Kaiser reach for his gun. Kaiser leaves the group and walks outside, taking the picture with him. He stares at the picture and apologises to Dratini, saying that he will never bother it again.
サファリボールと釣り竿だ。これがあればゲットゲッ。
はじめに言っておくが、サファリゾーンで使えるのはこのサファリボールと釣り竿だけじゃ。ルールを守らんときはわしのサンダーボルトが火を吹くぞ。
サンダーボルトって。あ、わかりました。
So we're really getting to the meat and bones of the reason why this episode was banned here. Kaiser puts a gun to Ash's head. Jeez. Literally right up to his forehead. I just can't. It's just so crazy to see. Especially because, I mean, Japanese shows, they tend to, even if they're like sort of aimed at kids, they don't mind to sort of, stray into this territory. But Pokemon seems so family-friendly focused that I wouldn't have expected it from this. So, wow, just wow. I thought it was kind of weird that Kaiser is so protective of the Dratini and doesn't want anybody to know that Dratini is in the Safari Zone. But then he has just a picture of him with the Dratini hanging up in his office, which I can only assume that this is where everybody who comes to the Safari Zone gets their Safari Balls from. So, why would you have it there? It just doesn't make any sense. I do like the little bit of backstory, though, we get to sort of explain why you have a limited amount of balls to use in the Safari Zone. They talk about sort of the over hunting of Pokemon in there, and it was sort of wrecking the land and ruining the Pokemon that are there. So they've limited it to 30, which I think, yeah, it's cool that they explained that, because they never really give an explanation in the show. I mean, you can kind of infer that, but yeah, it's nice that they actually go out of their way to explain it here. Meanwhile, Ash calls Professor Oak for further details, and Oak explains that he knows Kaiser well. 30 years ago, a Dratini was found in the Safari Zone by Kaiser himself. Trainers from all over flocked to the Safari Zone to catch Dratini, but while they were there, they caught many other Pokemon in the process, literally destroying the Safari Zone. Since then, only the use of Safari Balls has been allowed in the Safari Zone. The Dratini was never found, and all that remains is a picture. Team Rocket, overhearing the conversation, decides to catch Dratini and the Safari Zone's other Pokemon. Later, Ash, Misty and Brock are about to enter the Safari Zone, with Safari Balls and fishing rods in hand. They are confronted by Team Rocket, who proposes a challenge. Whichever group catches more Pokemon will win. If Ash and his friends win, Team Rocket won't bother the group ever again. If Team Rocket wins, they will take all of the group's Pokemon. Ash accepts the challenge, confident that he will win.
ロケット弾。
ほら、そこで何しとる？すぐ降りろ。
すぐに降りてやるからちょっとお待ち。
一応やることをやっとかないとね。
世界の破壊を防ぐため、
世界の平和を守るため、
愛と真実の悪を貫く
ラブリーチャーミーな敵役、
武蔵
小次郎。
降りてこいと言っとるじゃろう。
So Oak actually mentions or refers to Dratini as a legendary Pokemon here, which I thought was funny. They were so sort of flippant with their description of Pokemon as legendary here. I don't think they realized how sort of defined legendary Pokemon would become eventually. So yeah, it makes these references look a little silly. We also get Oak flipping his shit about Ash not catching more Pokemon again here. He's really been on Ash's back recently about not catching more Pokemon, but I'm fine with Ash not catching more Pokemon because, as we see with Tauros later on, he doesn't actually do a whole lot with these Pokemon, so I'd rather him stick to a core team that can actually get some time to shine. I really like that Team Rocket was somehow able to get on top of the Safari Zone sign here without ever being noticed. It's not something you could really just sneakily climb up, so impressive that they apparently got up there without anybody ever hearing or seeing them. It's just, yeah, they're obviously masters of stealth. And then after that, we get Kaiser, who's dual-wielding pistols trying to murder these 3 people standing on top of a sign who haven't really done much wrong yet. They've just sort of challenged the gang to a catching contest, and, they haven't actually, committed any crimes. I mean, they're allowed to catch Pokemon here. So the fact that Kaiser is literally shooting at them, trying to murder them, is just bizarre. Kaiser is off his rocker. The whole catching competition is sort of weird here, though. Why would Ash and the gang agree to these stakes? It doesn't make any sense. Ash gets literally nothing out of winning this. Because why would Team Rocket even stick to their word when it comes to, leaving the gang alone? It just makes no sense. So they can easily go back on that, but if Ash has to hand over his Pokemon, can't really go back on that. So it's just no point Ash competing in this at all. So the first Pokemon that Ash and his friends see are a herd of Tauros, and Ash and Brock catch 2 of them easily with Safari Balls. The group then hides behind some bushes while observing a Rhyhorn. Ash throws a Safari Ball at it, but just then the horde of Tauros run past, causing Ash to end up catching another Tauros. Jessie observes the group from afar, commenting on how Team Rocket will end up getting all of the Pokemon anyways. It's revealed that Team Rocket is inside the entrance building, with James holding a firearm to Kaiser's head. Jessie holds another firearm to Kaiser's head while asking him to tell them where Dratini is. Kaiser resists, prompting Jessie to send out Arbok to wrap itself around him. After several unsuccessful attempts at getting Kaiser to talk, Team Rocket sends out a mecha that tickles Kaiser, causing him to finally concede. So the cut to Kaiser being held at gunpoint by Team Rocket was not what I was expecting to see here. I knew that Kaiser was the one sort of holding up guns, but I'd never seen that Team Rocket also do it, and it really caught me off guard. It actually blew me away. I thought I'd be prepared for anything the episode threw at me, but I wasn't expecting Team Rocket to be threatening a man with a gun. Even weirder is that Kaiser fights back here while he's at gunpoint, and instead of Jessie just shooting him or threatening him with the gun, she sends out Arbok. So, yeah, maybe they were bluffing, maybe there's no bullets in the gun or something. But yeah, why would you do that? You have a legit weapon that could kill this man, and you instead send out a Pokemon? Yeah, not really sure about that. And then after that, we cut to sort of an interrogation scene with Team Rocket and Kaiser, and it is so weird. They're all dressed up in costumes, and I'm sure there's a bunch of references that are flying over my head here because I'm not Japanese and I'm not entrenched in that culture. But it was super weird. Even if this episode didn't have a bunch of guns in it, it would still be an extremely weird episode. And a lot of it is based off this scene here where they're interrogating Kaiser. Also, a little fun fact to do with Team Rocket's tickling mecha. It actually makes a reappearance, and it's obviously its first appearance outside of Asia when it happens, in a marathon rivalry, which is 591 episodes later. So meanwhile, Misty shows off her lure case to the group, which includes a Magikarp, Seal, and Psyduck lure. She then takes out one modelled after herself and throws it into the lake. Soon after, she gets a bite from a Gyarados, but the line breaks, allowing the Gyarados to return to the water. Kaiser appears before them, still being tickled by the mecha, and asks them to help get it off of him. Pikachu uses Thunderbolt, effectively stopping the machine. Kaiser then reveals that Team Rocket is going after Dratini, who is in the Dragon Valley. Not much to say here. The only thing of real note is that this is the first appearance of Misty's special lure in the anime. However, due to this episode being banned basically everywhere, the lure first appeared in the dub in Bye Bye Psyduck. So, yeah, outside you just think about sort of this episode being banned and that, you miss out on the Tauros thing. But there are a couple other things like the mecha and the lure, which the Misty lure is actually kind of a little bit iconic with her character. So, yeah, it is interesting to note. So Team Rocket is at a lake that is inhabited by Dratini. James and Meowth don some scuba gear and attempt to find Dratini in the water while Jessie waits for them above. Suddenly, a Dratini emerges from the water and reveals itself to Jessie. She kneels down on the air supply pipe, causing James and Meowth to struggle to breathe, while she calls for the Dratini to come closer. Just as Jessie tries to grab it, James and Meowth splash out of the water, scaring it away. Jessie begins to yell at them, but Meowth reveals a backup plan to capture all the Pokemon in the lake. He explains that the electric bomb he is holding will zap all the Pokemon in the water, and cause them to rise to the surface. Just then, Ash, Misty, and Brock and Kaiser intervene. Jessie asks whether Ash has caught any Pokemon, and he answers that he has used up all of his Safari Balls, signifying victory. Jessie says that the game isn't over yet and throws in the bomb. So they seemingly make Ash capture 27 Tauros off screen, which is kind of weird, especially as someone who'd never seen this episode before, because they play up the fact that, Ash caught 30 Tauros, and with the way that it starts with Ash accidentally catching an extra Tauros, you think, okay, so like this is going to happen intermittently throughout the episode, and he's just going to be like, I'm going to catch this Pokemon now and then catch Tauros, and we're going to see at least a bunch of them to sort of like really, really play out the gag. But instead, we get the 2 moments of him catching Tauros, and then nothing. We just cut to here, and he's like, yeah, I used them all, and then eventually we find out that they're all Tauros, which, I don't know, I feel like it's a lot less funny, the way that it plays out there, to the way that it always played out in my head. Ash and Kaiser jump into the lake after the bomb, while Misty sends out her Staryu to assist Ash and Kaiser. Ash and Staryu catch up to Kaiser, and Ash orders Staryu to take Kaiser back to the surface. He reaches the bottom, retrieves the bomb, and starts to swim back up, but he runs out of air and falls to the lake bed. Suddenly, a storm begins and a giant whirlpool churns the lake's water. A bright blue light beams through the whirlpool, and a Dragonair emerges with Ash on its back as the skies clear up. Ash throws the bomb back at Team Rocket just as the timer sets off, causing Team Rocket to blast off. Ash returns to the group and Dragonair approaches Kaiser, who realizes that it's the same Dratini that he took care of all those years ago. A Dratini appears next to Dragonair, and Kaiser realizes that this is the Dratini's child. Both Kaiser and Dragonair are moved to tears by their reunion after so many years.
急に天気がザーザーと
湖があれは
伝説のポケモン白龍
So not a whole lot to actually talk about here. The action's kind of unremarkable here. I just want to know why there's such a long timer on the Team Rocket bomb. When Ash grabs it, the timer says something like a minute 15. Like it's something ridiculous like that, which there's no reason for it to have such a long timer. You could have put 15 seconds on it, literally. All you have to do is throw in the water. It's not like you need to like plant it and then run away. You're throwing it in the water. It's fine. The scene where Dratini evolves does look pretty cool. And I really wanted to know here, why does Kaiser have such a strong bond with the Dragonair here? It's never really explained. It's like talking about that Kaiser protected it, but we don't get any explanation of what actually happened. So yeah, I think for this episode to have a little bit more impact, we needed a little bit more info on the relationship between Kaiser and Dragonite, or Dragonair I should say, sorry. So we go back to the Warden's office, and Ash promises Oak that they will never share their experience in the Safari Zone with others. Oak says that the group has grown up well and asks Ash if he has sent him any new Pokemon. Just then, a herd of Tauros trample over the professor in a stampede, revealing that in the end, Ash failed to catch anything but Tauros. Ash and his friends bid farewell to Kaiser, with Dratini and Dragonair watching over them. So that ends the episode, but I've got about 1 million pieces of trivia here. So, starting us off, this is the first episode in which a main character catches more than one Pokemon of the same species. This wouldn't occur again until the 7th episode of the new series that is going on right now. That's 1,057 episodes later. So yeah, long time coming. With 30 Pokemon, this episode features the largest number of Pokemon caught by a main character in a single episode, and by a very wide margin, I would say. Moving on to Ash's Tauros specifically now, none of the Tauros are actually shown again in the Indigo League, which means outside of Japan, Tauros literally do not appear at all in Kanto, other than for the offhanded mention from Oak. Famously, Ash actually uses his Tauros in the Winners' Cup match in the Orange Islands, and he uses it pretty successfully. It's also been used in the Silver Conference and Battle Frontier, which it's not too shabby for a Pokemon that was basically a gag capture at first. Like, him catching 30 Tauros is entirely a joke. But the writers eventually flipped that on its head, and they used it for 3 really important battles. Like, the Winners' Cup match for quite a while, was the only thing of note that Ash had won through battling, until obviously the Battle Frontier, which again, Tauros was used there, and then obviously eventually he wins the Alola League. So Tauros was actually a pretty common theme throughout him being successful, which is kind of fun to look at. And as I sort of alluded to, the Tauros are the only Pokemon that Ash has ever owned for more than one episode, which were never used in battle during the region that they were obtained in. It's also never been revealed whether Ash uses the same Tauros whenever one of them is transferred to him, or if Professor Oak simply sends him a random one each time, which I like to think, I always imagine that it's the same Tauros, but if these are all different ones, that's actually pretty wild because you've got one Tauros that was able to hold its own in the Orange Islands, one that was able to hold its own in the Silver Conference, and then one that was able to hold its own in the Battle Frontier. That's a pretty strong herd of Tauros. And finally, Ash was actually offered a Rhyhorn in exchange for his Tauros after winning a Tauros battling competition. It's fun to note because Ash had actually tried to capture a Rhyhorn in the Safari Zone, but then the Tauros ran past. So yeah, it's kind of interesting that it came back. I wonder if that was deliberate. It probably wasn't. It was probably a happy coincidence. But yeah, it is cool to note. And so the episode ends, and then the Japanese ending credit at this point in time was just a song sung by Meowth, and he's playing the guitar in the credits, and oh my god, I love this so much. Please do yourself a favor if you've never seen this, look it up on YouTube. It's just, I'm going to assume it's on YouTube. If not, there's other ways to track down this episode. God, it's just so... I just loved it. I played it through entirely, which is not something I usually do with ending credits.
青い青い静かな夜にはおいら一人で哲学するのにゃ草むらで虫たちがコロコロチリチリおいしそうに泣いてるけど今夜は食べてあげないのにゃ
But with the episode done and dusted, it's time for my thoughts on the episode. I actually thought this was a really fun episode. The gun stuff is pretty jarring for the show because, while we have seen weapons before, they've never been used in such a serious way like this. It just feels completely different. I know it's played off comedically, but it doesn't feel as comedic as the other two sort of examples of firearms being used previously. And even removing all of the gun stuff, as I said, the entire middle section with Team Rocket is so bizarre that it gives a really weird feeling to this episode. I don't think it's quite as weird as something like Beauty and the Beach or the Kangaskhan Kid, but it's sort of on a similar wavelength. Overall, I think I just enjoyed getting to watch an original series episode in its original language. Something about that just felt, I don't know, fun. From memory, I think the Gen 5 anime is the only series that I've actually seen in Japanese. So basically everything in this episode was fresh to me from sort of how the Japanese was operating at that point in time. As I mentioned in this, the opening and closing credit songs were completely new to me and everything. So yeah, it was a fun little journey through a Japanese only episode, and we're going to be getting another one pretty soon. So I'm excited. So a recap of major events here. We've actually got some major events after 2 episodes where absolutely nothing happened. Ash and his friends enter the Safari Zone and receive 30 Safari Balls from Kaiser to be used within the zone. Ash uses his Safari Balls to catch 30 Tauros, all of which he sends to Professor Oak's laboratory. And Ash also tries to catch a Rhyhorn, but fails, obviously catching a Tauros instead. So no changes to Ash Ketchum's trainer win-loss record so far. He is sitting at 7 wins and 5 losses, and he's still on a 4-win streak, which is not too bad, but yeah, there's not a whole lot of battling coming up, I believe. And with that said, it's time to jump into our question of the week, delivered via Pokemail. So in celebration of Ash catching a gajillion Tauros, I want to ask all of you, which Pokemon would you want to catch 30 times? Personally, I would want to catch something really cute and fluffy and adorable, maybe 30 Shaman. You could probably use that as a really comfy bed, or, imagine being carried around sort of in a chariot of Shaman. That would be so comfortable. So yeah, it would be something like that for me. But what would you want to get 30 of? Maybe you want 30 Charizard, just so you have your own little mini army and you can sort of just steamroll anyone in your way. But yeah, let me know in the comment section of the YouTube version of this episode, and I'll leave a response. But that's it for today's episode. Thanks for listening to Who's That Pokemon. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you're not subscribed to the podcast, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, YouTube, Google Play, basically any podcast service that exists. You can also find the show on Twitter at Who's That PKMN Pod to keep up with the latest updates for the show, and I'm on Twitter as @SauceMarlow. You can also check out my YouTube channel, WTP Productions. There you'll find all sorts of Pokemon content covering the games, anime, everything in between. At the moment, I'm in the midst of ranking all of the Pokemon films from worst to best. Part 1 of that went up last week, and Part 2, the finale, the top 11 films, is going up this week. And then the following week, I'm going to have a review of Mewtwo Strikes Back Evolution as it hits Netflix. So, obviously, if you're listening to this podcast, you're a fan of the anime. So I would highly recommend checking out those videos. You will definitely get a kick out of them, especially I think the ranking one. If you're listening to this sort of for the nostalgia trip of going through the older Pokemon episodes, I do discuss a lot of the older stuff, and you'll get to see what my opinions are of the Pokemon movies earlier than you would if you're just listening to the podcast, because I've got this question a little bit. I do plan on doing the movies when they come up in the chronological timeline, but obviously that's so far away. It's not until the 60s, episode 60 odd is when Mewtwo Strikes Back slots in. So we're still 30 or so episodes away. But if you want to hear my opinion on that movie, you can get it by checking out the countdown videos. But that's all for this episode. I hope you join me again next time as I take a look back at the Bridge Bike Gang and Ditto's mysterious mansion. Here we get some very, very, very minor backstory for Team Rocket, and Ash and his friends meet Duplica for the first time, which means we get to see the inspiration for all of that weird-looking Ditto merch.